Thanks for joining us on The Other Side. Today I'm surrounded by John Lennon fans who remember all too clearly the news reports from December 8th, 1980. Let's take a look.
Fans of ex-Beatle John Lennon are continuing to hold vigil outside the Dakota apartment building, the site of Lennon's murder. The alleged gunman, 25-year-old Mark David Chapman from Decatur, Georgia, is in custody. Lennon was reportedly returning home from a 5-hour recording session to his West 72nd Street residence when he was shot. The coroner says Lennon was shot 5 times in the back with a .38 caliber revolver. Pilgrimages are being held around the world today, and in Central Park, fans continue to pour in. The New York post offices are already flooded with letters and packages addressed to his widow, Yoko Ono. John Lennon dead at age 40.
Shocking, but you may not know this, but John Lennon's last days, to a great degree, were dictated by an interest in the paranormal. To tell us about John's last days is celebrity photographer and close friend of John Lennon, Bob Gruen. Thanks for joining us, Bob. Where were you when you heard the news that John Lennon was murdered?
Well, actually, I was home in my darkroom making the pictures that I had just taken of him 2 days earlier. And the doorman rang my bell and told me he had heard on the radio that John was shot.
How did you and John become friends?
We met during an interview that an interviewer had asked me to take the pictures, and I did some good ones, and they liked them.
Sweet man, wasn't he?
Yeah, we got along very well. We met that night, and then it turned out they used some of those pictures on the album cover for the Sometime in New York album. And they lived half a block away from me. So we started spending more time and visiting, and they hired my wife as their personal assistant.
I loved him because he was this wonderful combination of the eccentric artist who was so brilliant, but yet very down-to-earth at the same time, which is interesting. Now, supposedly, John and Yoko were heavily into numerology and tarot cards. Did that dictate their lives? How big an influence was this?
I don't know if it dictated lives. They were very open to many different feelings and intuitions, but Yoko always kept track of things on the tarot cards and the numbers and the astrology, and they wouldn't start projects on certain days if the time wasn't right.
Did John believe that he and Yoko had a psychic connection?
Oh, very much so. I think they knew they had a very deep connection. There was one time when John was on a sailboat, and he was sailing from Bermuda to New York, and a storm had come up, and the whole crew got very sick, but because John was eating a macrobiotic diet, he stayed well, and...
Well, they got actually food sickness, didn't they?
Yeah, they were throwing up in most of the crew.
And he was the only one who's healthy on board.
Yeah, he was kind of bugged about it because he had hired them to take care of him, and then in the end, he had to steer the ship, because if the ship hits a wave, and you drown no matter how rich you are, you know?
Yeah, that's right.
And so he was tied to the wheel with the yellow slicker, and he felt like a sailor trying to keep the boat together. But he said that he was very aware that Yoko's spirit was guiding over him, and that he really felt that he would be safe because she was watching over him. And he put it in one of his songs, in the Oh Yoko song on the Double Fantasy album, when he said, even when you're out at sea and nowhere is the place to be, your spirit's guiding over me, Oh Yoko.
You know, I was a young teenager when the Beatles first came to fame, and so I was a fan who followed, the whole story. And the big part of the story, of course, was how evidently all the Beatles, and especially John Lennon, have always been, all through their life. They experimented with spirituality in all forms. What was his spiritual frame of mind near the end of his life?
Well, I think John was always very open to many different spiritual influences. He wasn't somebody who had a closed mind and you had to prove it to him. It was kind of the opposite. He was open to many different beliefs and feelings until it was proven wrong or something.
He had an encounter with a UFO or a flying saucer. Tell us about that.
Right. Well, he mentioned that on an album, on the Walls and Bridges album. There's a statement that on that date in August, I think it was '74, he saw a flying saucer. But one night he was at home and he was watching TV. He said he saw some lights reflecting in a doorway on the rooftop where there shouldn't have been any lights reflecting. He went out to see what it was, and it was a flying saucer that was just floating across 52nd Street past his building. And he said it was so normal that at first he didn't realize there was anything strange, because it really was there. There was no spooky music like in the movies. It
wasn't accompanied by Hollywood effects.
And then he suddenly realized, like, this is a flying saucer, and he started screaming, where are you going? What are you doing? Take me with you. And his assistant came out and took some pictures of it. And so John called me up and asked me to develop the film for him, which actually came out completely blank.
One of the most exciting things about being his fan over the years is that a new album would come out and you'd just die to get it, and then, of course, you were struggling to understand what is he talking about, because some of the art of the words was so difficult. Does it make it richer to be a fan of his, knowing him? Did you have an insight into some of what his poetry and lyrics were because you knew him?
John once said that he found out what his songs meant when he would read the reviews.
His fans would tell him what he was talking about.
He was obviously such a diversified individual. What would you say you missed most about him?
Being with him. He was a very fun guy to be with. He was very funny. He was very perceptive. He was very intelligent. He would say things that were so perceptive, and yet he would say it in a little twist, a little funny way, a little pun. So you'd always learn something and have a good time and a good laugh.
Was he tired as an artist, or do you think some of his best stuff was
not at all.
ahead
He
of
had
him?
just had a 5-year rest when he was home raising Sean, and I think he had it was kind of an introspective period where he had mulled over all the things that he had thought all his life, and it was coming from such a position of strength. And the last interviews he did were the best I think he ever did. He knew what he was about. He knew how to say it, and he had a lot less fear.
You look at some of his age peers as artists, Elton John or the Rolling Stones, and some of their best work has been done in the past.
I think John was just beginning.
Absolutely, yeah.
Just beginning.
So we were really cut off from a lot of great stuff, weren't we?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Did John have strong feelings about the afterlife?
Yeah.
I don't know. We didn't really discuss it in those terms. You know, in the Imagine song, John says, "Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, and above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today." I think John believed in living for today and living this life, although he was open to the idea that there could be an afterlife or previous lives, but this one's the important one.
Do you still have contact with Yoko Ono?
Yes. She's been working quite a bit on her artwork this year. She's done a lot of new artworks this year.
So often we hear about people who die tragically, young, unexpectedly, that there's some way, as you think back, that they had some premonition that they were about to die. Do you think that was true of John Lennon? You were with him near the end.
No, because 2 days before he died, we were sitting on the floor talking about the upcoming tour. He was finishing, they had an album that they had just come out that was climbing up the charts, and they had another album in the can that was going to come out the following month, and we were talking about doing videos for the album, and then going on tour. We were talking about which restaurants we were going to eat in Paris, and where we were going to go shopping in Japan, and he was really looking forward to that.
More like just a beginning.
Oh, yeah, it was just starting all over.
Yeah. Yoko, of course, is very spiritual, and you talk about interest in psychic phenomena. Does she feel John still with her?
You'd have to ask her.
Yeah. She never talks about
I think
them.
a lot of people feel that John's with them. You know, you live with his artworks, and I hear his voice in the music all the time.
Yeah.
He's so popular, and just the artworks and the writings, so that he's
That's
still
what's so
with us
haunting
in that
about a
way.
death like this, is they're so present, because the voice, the face, the video, it's always
Well,
with
that was
you.
what's so nice about him, that being a great artist, he'll live with us forever.
Yeah. Well, next we'll meet a woman who claims she's been on tour of the spirit world with John Lennon as her guide when we come back.
When the Other Side returns.
Welcome back to The Other Side. Linda Keene is a medium who says she's been talking with John Lennon in the spirit world since 1987. Those conversations are chronicled in Linda's book, John Lennon in Heaven. Please welcome Linda Keene. I like that. Thank you for joining us, Linda. I just like the title right off, John Lennon in Heaven. Now set the stage for us. What is the spirit world, and how did you discover you could go there?
Well, as a child, I remember sitting in church, and I wasn't listening to the minister, but I was staring.
That's very bad, Linda. I'm not happy to hear that.
I was staring out through the stained glass windows, and I found myself in this other world, and I went there all the time. It was where people loved me very much as my own parents loved me, my best friends, a place that I felt really comfortable. And as I grew older, I realized that not everybody did that. And that's, I think, was my introduction to the spirit world.
And you've used this as your spiritual expression ever since, right? How did you meet John Lennon?
Well, I was teaching when he died, and I was teaching other people how to contact loved ones and the spirit world. So I did take a look at him at that time, but made no contact. And it wasn't until I had a dream, and the dream was that someone was writing a book called John Lennon in Heaven. And I suppose you could say that's the first time that I made contact with him.
You saw him, right, in this dream?
Yeah, and then, well, it took a year for me to get up the feeling that I really was going to write this book. So then I did go to meet him. I projected myself into this meadow like I was used to doing to contact the spirit world, and there he was.
What did he look like?
Well, he looked great, because the first time I saw him after he died, he looked so miserable and unhappy. So I was relieved to see that he was a very happy-looking being. And he did change. He looked different all the time. He never stayed the same.
What was he wearing?
Well, I mean, the first time, I guess he was wearing Levi's and cowboy boots, you know, all the things that you see him in pictures.
Like we would remember
Yeah,
him.
yeah.
Okay. What did you talk about?
Well, we talked a lot about what it was like to die and how he felt after dying, and then also what he had been doing in the spirit world.
Mm-hmm. He talked about his death.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. Was he shocked?
Well, yes, because of all the people who were so shocked and anguished over his death. I think all the attention that he got from all those people put him in a kind of a very strange space. And for a while he was in like red clouds of sorrow and anguish. And it was a very, very terrible place to be.
He spoke to you, didn't he? What did he say to you?
John says death is just another step in life. And so you go on this journey and learn many, many things.
Now, you talk in your book a lot about past lives. John and Yoko believe that they were lovers in a past life. Tell us about that.
John and Yoko were talking about the fact that they were Robert and Elizabeth Browning before John died. And they had even recorded songs, Take Off on the Poems by Robert and Elizabeth Browning. So I went to open this big book of mine to look at a picture of Robert Browning.
Yeah, you found photos, didn't you? I think we're going to be able to look at those now. You came across some photos, and there's a real resemblance, isn't there? First we have John Lennon, okay, now Robert Browning. It is startling, isn't it? Then we can put them together, I think. If that's the jawline, it's amazing. And then Yoko, and here's Yoko Ono, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And there they are together. That's amazing. That really is shocking.
Yes.
Were there any similarities in the poetry at all?
Well,
might be tempting to read into it, maybe,
yeah,
I guess, huh?
Maybe the emotions, but I think it's reading into it. I never really got into the poetry. I tried, but
But what's fun for fans as a result of this now is to look at some of the Browning's poetry and sort of feel what they feel. Why has John chosen to talk to you?
Well, I suppose there's a couple of reasons. One of them is I feel that we share a similar spiritual attitude. I definitely appreciate humor in spirituality.
And a sense of humor was a
I
central
think that's
part
very
of who he
important,
was.
yes.
Yeah. Well, as a minister comedian, I certainly feel at home with that. Yes, sir.
I was never a great fan of John's, but does he have a message for his fans, or does he have a message for all of us?
We need to make our lives as magic and spectacular as we make him. That's his message. We need to do that for ourselves instead of projecting. The hero worship is beautiful, but now he wants us to apply it to ourselves.
He seemed uncomfortable with hero worship anyway.
Very, very uncomfortable.
Yeah. Which is part of the tragedy of his death, because he was working so hard to be just accessible and...
Yes, and because he wanted everyone to you know, enjoy their life and appreciate themselves, and that was his message, really.
Yeah.
I'd like to know, what is your educational background? And you mentioned you share the same spirit. Can you elaborate on that?
You mean
as
spiritual?
Well, yeah, spiritual.
Yeah.
As well as, I would think John's spirit would be happy unless he's in a place where it's not a happy place, because all the tributes that were paid to him was phenomenal. Why wasn't he happy, as you stated earlier? I would think he would be extremely happy unless he's in the wrong place.
He is now. He is now.
Well, no, I'm not talking about now. You stated earlier.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, well, I could answer that first. I have heard that certain people, when they have died and come back from, on the operating table, come back from death, have not had a beautiful experience. They have had a hell experience. And that was very shocking to me. Whatever happens to you after you die has a lot to do with how you are when you are alive and how you think and what you believe in. If you have certain fears that you have not come to terms with, it may be that when you first die, you are in a kind of a hellish situation.
And that's the situation you felt was happening with him, that he is
Yes.
happy now, but there was a transition time where he was...
The transition. Oh,
in a
he's
little-
incredibly happy now. I mean...
Well, he's
But,
John Lennon's
yeah,
ahead
but
of you.
so I was so shocked when I first saw him, when he first died, because I expected him to be blissful and, you know, but he wasn't. And that was upsetting.
When we return, psychic Kelley Joyce Neff will try to contact John right here in our studio.
When the other side continues, the words of John Lennon, spoken by the woman who channels him.
Welcome back to the other side. We're talking with people who say they are in touch with John Lennon in the spirit world. Joining us now is the author of Everyday Life in Two Worlds, psychic Kelley Joyce Neff. Thank you, Kelley, for joining us. Your experiences with John Lennon are a little bit different than Linda's. How does John speak to you?
Well, John speaks to me in the same way that he does to Linda, except that I also have the experience of allowing him to use my body. I can hear his voice in the same way that Linda does, and I do all the time, but sometimes he finds it expedient to talk to people through me. And I have learned how to do this through years, my whole life, years of experience of being strange, hearing voices. And what happened with John was that it was just automatic. One day I was sitting there with a friend of mine, and we were talking about John and the Beatles and their message to the world, and it just came out, and he just started talking to me and talking to my friend through me.
Why isn't this just your imagination?
Because I didn't ask for it. I didn't. It's something that comes over me. It's not something that I sought out. It's not something in my everyday life that I would consciously seek.
You're telling us that this feels different than just a regular human imagination?
Absolutely, positively. I know comparatively little about the private life of John Lennon, but he says some of the most remarkably intimate things about his family, his relationship with his mother, with Yoko, and how he feels about things that I am not privy to.
We were talking about past lives before. Do you believe you had past life contact with John Lennon?
There was one in the 18th century where I and the man that I was married to were great fans of his music even then. And
He was a musician back then?
Oh, yes.
What name did he go under back then?
Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart.
He was Mozart?
He was Mozart.
It's not lost on you how bizarre that sounds. You know that,
I
don't you?
fully realize that
Yeah.
sounds incredibly bizarre.
Yeah. And it's hard for people to access that. This isn't just your enthusiasm because you were such a fan of his.
John came into my life in a very powerful way. And I was sitting with a friend of mine, and we were talking about the Beatles. She was telling me about how much they had to do with her spiritual life and her emergence into what she called consciousness in the late 60s and 70s. And all of a sudden, I found myself as a young man standing in this dark club with a girl sitting at a table in front of me, and I knew that he had overdosed on something and was about to die and didn't want to die in the club or on the street. And so there was an archway and a local band was playing, and I looked over in the corner at the guitar player, and he had a familiar face, a face that I knew, and I looked at him, and there was love there, and it kept me stable until I could get out of that room. And me, looking at this scene that's flashing before my eyes, Kelley looked at the guitar player in the corner, and I said, "Oh my God, it's George. We're in the cavern, and it's the Beatles."
So consequently, these experiences are so vivid that it actually brings the person's presence. Are you going to channel John now?
Absolutely.
Why don't you go ahead and do that?
John has a message for all of you here today. I want to say that none of you is here by accident. So welcome, and we'll see what John has to say.
We'll be able to question him as well?
Absolutely. First of all, I want to say hello to all of you. It's been a long time. My friends here, these two, Linda and Kelley, they've traveled a long road with me, and it's a big deal to them to be here. And I first want to say thanks, love, to both of them. There's a lot of focus right now on the reemergence of John Lennon, and I'd like to say about that I've been waiting for this, not the whole time since I've been what you would call dead, but for about 10 years. There were things I had to work on, plenty of things, and it's taken me this long to get back to where I could be ready to take up the reins again, so to speak. There are people gathering, I know, all over the world on the anniversary of my death, and I want to say that I'm grateful for the love, but I see a lot of sadness too, a lot of anger and lack of forgiveness for Mark. And I want to say that this isn't necessary anymore, but I'm grateful for all the love. As Yoko said, right after, when all the mail came and the flowers and the gifts, we're both very grateful for the love.
Could you answer some questions for us?
Sure.
Why do you speak through Kelley?
'Cause she lets me.
How do you describe where you are now?
It's a kind of gray place where you can make anything you want. It can be Linda's Meadow, or it can be Buckingham Palace, if you want it to be. And we make everything we want to be, the way we want it to be, to play our little games, to try out scenes. If we want to try something in a lifetime, upcoming, it's anything that we want it to be.
Were there still songs that you wanted to write before you were murdered?
There were some songs I was working on, some things with Yoko, and that was my personality, doing that. I had lots of work to do, I thought, and I had to shelve that, but the work that I had to do on myself, on John, was more important. It was more timely than the songs that I was working on.
Hi, John. You said you went through this hellish period, and I'm wondering, the way you died and the way you lived before you died, there's a lot of people talking nice about you after you were dead, but like the tabloid situation and all the really bad things that were said about
Yeah, you weren't a choir boy.
Is there anything you would like to refute right now that was said after you died, as, you know, like from...
Well, you know, people say all kinds of things, and you just have to see that that's where they're at. That's their trip, and you have to let it go.
Did you know any former Beatles in your past lives?
Yeah. One time that Kelley was talking about, and Linda has talked about in the book, we were all together in Salzburg and in London in the 18th century with George and Paul, and Ringo was there, but he was only an assistant choir master.
Bob Gruen tells us that you had a favorite restaurant that you used to enjoy going to, owned by a friend Richie. Could you tell us the name of that restaurant?
Delco's.
John, I'd like to know, do you believe in God?
It depends on what you mean by God.
Someone you might have met there?
There's this notion of Jehovah, this great old man with a beard, you know, and I can say I haven't met him, but I know that there's a spirit that moves us all together. It's in all of us. all the time. And that's God to me.
John, I was wondering if you have any comment about Charles Manson and the tie-in with Helter Skelter.
I must admit I was fascinated with Charlie as a person, as a human being, what went on in that mind. He had an idea in his head, and it was so fixed, but the spirit that animates him is still a beautiful particle of light, and it shines even through all that darkness. He's learned a lot in prison. He's come a long way, and he's got a long way to go. But that's my own judgment.
We'll be back in a minute.
When the other side...
Welcome back to the other side. Medium Kelley Joyce Neff says she is channeling the spirit of ex-Beatle John Lennon. Bob Gruen also tells us that Yoko made a special pin for you just before you died in 1980. Could you tell us what was on that pin?
It was two hearts together.
On the phone now is John Lennon's former personal assistant, Fred Seaman. Fred, are you there?
I am here. How are you, Will?
I'm doing fine. How long did you work for John and Yoko?
About 2 years, 1979, 1980, and then I stayed on another year with Yoko.
Yoko. What were your duties?
I was hired to keep John company, act as a conduit to the outside world. John was living fairly isolated in 1979. Answer his fan mail, buy his newspapers, books and magazines. I bought a car my third week on the job. I would drive him around New York, and eventually I traveled with him to Long Island, Palm Beach, and Bermuda, where John and I lived for about 6 weeks in the summer of 1980.
You've been listening to Kelley channel John. What do you think?
Well, I'm a little bit skeptical. I haven't heard anything that, any fan, couldn't just come up with.
Do you have a question for John through Kelley?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I do. First of all, I am curious what John thought of my book.
Did you like his book, John? Fred's book?
I haven't done much reading lately. Seriously. My friend.
All right. Let me ask you another question. What do you think, John, of Yoko's merchandising of your name and image the last few years? For instance, she's been licensing your artwork to be used on ties, coffee mugs, aprons. She's sold bronze replicas of the shirt that you wore when you were shot, the blood-encrusted glasses that you wore. Those are selling for about $25,000. She's also sold your clothes, furniture, guitars, and she's even selling your artwork, which she colorizes and signs her name to. Do you think that's okay to do?
You have to understand that Yoko and I are one, and me things are her things, and I don't need them anymore, so what she chooses to do with them is entirely up to her.
Yeah, but don't you think they should be in a museum, maybe, instead of being sold at auctions and all over the place?
Yoko knows the best thing to do with me things, where particular pieces belong. We've talked about it in dreams and meditations that she does. And I'm not saying to you that I'm saying to sell all me things for great fancy prices. It's not that. It's that she knows what she needs to do for her and for Sean and for the public. If it makes people happy to have these things, then I say take them.
Well, what about Julian? Julian has not received any of his share of the inheritance, and he's even given interviews recently complaining about this and threatening to sue Yoko. What do you feel about Julian being practically disinherited.
That's a very difficult situation. It was even when me and Cynthia broke up, and I'm sorry for it.
Fred, let me stop you here. Kelley,
Sure.
would you please come out of your trance? Fred, were John and Yoko active with tarot when you worked for them?
Well, it was really more Yoko. She used the occult, tarot card readers, numerology, directionalism to make all decisions in their household. And John had pretty much delegated all decision-making power to Yoko. So, she would justify her decisions by saying, well, the psychic said we should do this, and, now is not a good time to do that. And he seemed to go along with that.
I take it you're not a fan of Yoko Ono's.
I have nothing against her, but during my years with them, I felt that she was taking advantage of John. I saw, her leading her own life while keeping John very dependent on her. My own feeling was, and it's the feeling of other people as well, that John loved Yoko deeply, but that Yoko did not love him, and that was distressing, to say the least.
Was John Lennon open to the possibility of an afterlife? Did he believe in an afterlife?
Yes, he would say flip things like, dying and being reborn is like getting out of one car and into another. But he was a deeply spiritual man, but not in a conventional sense. He mistrusted institutionalized religion as represented by the institution of the church, but he described himself as a born-again pagan, and he investigated all sorts of religions.
Thank you, Fred.
Sure.
Thank you. This is Dr. Lily Friedland. Is there another explanation for what they're experiencing?
Well, there are definitely other explanations. I do want to remind you that psychologists do study the paranormal, and parapsychology does examine a lot of these aspects as well. But one of the first things we would ask is, are some people involved in a time warp kind of experience? What did John Lennon either represent to them personally, or what attributes, what kinds of traits that they admired in him reminded them either of themselves or the way they wanted to be? Or was this mindful of a time in their life which was very special that they're trying to hang on to?
Of course, this all sounds like loving, and I don't mean that cynically, but loving admiration for a great artist. But he was killed by someone who distorted that completely out of hand, became a fanatic, and there's really a dangerous line here, isn't there, between adoration and stepping over a line of reality.
Well, I think most of us have our heroes, and most of us admire people and typically try to emulate them and try to model ourselves more like them. Then there are some people who truly step beyond the line, sometimes about people they admire and some people whom they hate.
Mm-hmm. Which was a lot of the tragedy with John Lennon, making himself so accessible at the end of his life that he didn't protect himself from the reality that people are disturbed. Linda Keene says she can teach her audience to get in touch with John Lennon, so don't go away. We're talking with Linda Keene and Kelley Joyce Neff. Both say they talked to John Lennon in the spirit world. This is such an esoteric concept. I mean, I have a hard time understanding what channeling is. Linda, you say you can actually teach us how to channel John Lennon or a close level. Why don't you take us through this exercise?
Well, I don't even use the word channeling. You see, I taught people for many years how to communicate with the world of spirit. And I've seen that it's actually a very simple thing. We have actually two kinds of imagination: perceptive imagination, which connects us with the world of spirit that we use with visualization or knowing. And we have creative imagination, which as a spirit we use to create the reality around us. And this was what John was telling.
Show us.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like you just to focus in on your heart area, your chest area. And if you would like to close your eyes, that's great. And you don't have to do it if you don't want. Just start to feel this chest area. And imagine that you have this beautiful flower opening up in your chest area. And you feel this blossom opening up, and you feel the energy there. And you can begin to also feel yourself breathing in and out of this area. Feel your breath going in and out. And now I would like you to get in touch with the person that you would like to just say hi to. You're going to just say hello and communicate. You can either imagine that you're turning on a television screen in front of yourself, or you can imagine you're turning on a radio and you're going to be listening. And the Spirit needs us to use our thoughts and our feelings to reach us. That's the only way they can reach us, is through our own thoughts and feelings. So allow your thoughts and feelings to work, and allow yourself just to have a brief little conversation. You can ask a question, or maybe this person has something to tell you, and just see what happens. Okay, now you can say goodbye for now. Turn off the television or the radio and feel your heart center again. And say hello to yourself and breathe in and out of the flower. And feel comfortable with yourself. And then I'm very curious if anybody did get any messages. Yeah, right.
I made contact with my dad, who passed away on my birthday about 21 years ago.
What did he tell you?
Just stay well, be healthy, and take care of your family.
Be a good boy, right? He's always your dad.
Right.
Okay, good. You know, it's interesting. There's a therapy called Gestalt therapy, and a therapist will take you through an exercise where a loved one who might have died, you actually envision them sitting there, say to them what you didn't get a chance to say in life, and then through your knowing who they are, have them respond. You sit in that chair and respond. Is that a psychologist's channeling in a way?
It can be, but it certainly helps the person, because we all often have many unfinished things we haven't said to people we love. And by saying it, sometimes we work through a lot of our own grief and other feelings that we need to do.
See, by framing this as spirituality, as paranormal, it makes people say, well, this channeling is sort of weird. But in fact, within ourselves is a real understanding of so much about the other person. You know what your mom would say to you in this situation.
Correct.
So if you get identified, connected to a star, to a John Lennon, there's a sense that you know what he'd have to say back. But the difficulty is, if you're just a fan, you really don't know what he'd say back.
No, that's true. But stop and think, what do most people start imagining they hear? What they get typically are the things that make them feel good about themselves, or some kind of forgiveness, which helps them grow and get on with their life in some positive way. So all of this can be extremely helpful to the individual.
It's always, again, as a matter of balance and how you're using it. Okay. More from the spirit world of John Lennon when we return.
Accommodations have been furnished by the beautiful Continental Plaza Hotel, minutes from the LA airport, offering free airport shuttle, fitness center, pool, and other amenities. The Continental Plaza Hotel.
As far as actually channeling John Lennon here today, I'm not really so sure. According to Bob Gruen, John's favorite restaurant was named Home, and the pin Yoko gave him was an American flag, not two hearts. But who knows, maybe Kelley knows something Bob Gruen doesn't. John Lennon was a lightning rod for an entire generation, and all of us will continue to experience his presence in his wonderful music. Thanks for joining us on The Other Side. Here's a preview of our next show.